Hello, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture. We're grateful to our partners this evening, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, Alta Journal, Daughter Press, Penn, University of California, Riverside, University of Southern California, the Women's Review of Books, and the Writers Guild Foundation. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our mission. Joan Didion is one of the defining writers of our time. What is it about her voice, the way it addresses the world and the self, that resonates so deeply with the truth of contemporary experience and makes her an inescapable influence on writers who've come after? To consider these and other questions, we've assembled a distinguished panel. This program marks publication of Joan Didion, the 1980s and 90s, volume number 341 in the Library of America series, edited by David Ulin, who joins us tonight. David also edited a companion volume devoted to Didion's breakthrough writings from the 1960s and 70s. A third volume is still to come. This Library of America edition is being prepared in consultation with Joan Didion and published with support from the following donors: Harrison Ford, Alan Alda, Big Beach, Bodie Boatwright, Susan L. Brody, Lucy Fisher and Douglas Z. Wick, Louise Grunwald, Penelope C. Hall, David Hare, ICM Partners, Kathleen Kennedy, Lynn and Norman Lear, Carrie Lowell, Liam Neeson, Wyndham Robertson, Richard Roth, David Bruce Smith, Meryl Streep, and Jan Wenner. Thanks to their generosity, it will stand as a lasting testimony to Didion's contributions to American writing. David Ulin, editor of the Library of America Didion edition, is an award-winning essayist and poet. With him in conversation tonight are Laila Lalami, whose 2014 historical novel, The Moor's Account, won the American Book Award, and Steph Cha, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and California Book Award, whose most recent novel is Your House Will Pay. In a special appearance, Obie Award-winning actress Mia Barron will reprise a moment from her remarkable performance in The White Album, based on Didion's classic essay. The panelists join us in a second. First, we welcome another very special guest, acclaimed actor, producer, and director Griffin Dunne, Joan Didion's nephew and director of the 2017 documentary, Joan Didion, The Center Will Not Hold. A reminder that we invite your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. Now, here's Griffin Dunne.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Thank you for having me. I extend my best wishes from Joan Didion, my aunt. She's honored to be honored by the Library of America. It ensures that her work will always be read. There's been a real resurgence in her writings by younger generations, and this does it even more, and it makes her eternal. She's very honored. She also like to extend, as would I, thanks to all the donors to Library of America to make this possible. 3 volumes. It's just a great honor, and she sends her best, and I just share in my eternal pride for her. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Griffin. And now I turn things over to David Ulin and the panel. David, it's all yours.
Thanks, Max. Thank you, Griffin, for that lovely introduction. Hello, Laila.
Hi.
Hello, Steph. I feel like we have Los Angeles in the house, so we'll talk about things. I'm delighted to be here. It's been a real pleasure. One of my most profound professional pleasures has been putting together these two anthologies. As I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit, I first sort of came across Didion when I was 18 and living in San Francisco on Haight Street in 1980, and my mother, not one to normally recommend books, called me up and said, read Slouching Towards Bethlehem, the Haight-Ashbury essay, please. I think she was afraid she was going to lose me and the essay. So there's a direct line between my 19-year-old self and my nervous mother and where we are today. And I don't know about too many things I can say that about. I'm really delighted that Laila and Steph, both colleagues of mine and friends of mine, are here, have agreed to be here to discuss the work. I want to just set up quickly how the conversation is going to go. We're going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll break and have the Mia Barron the Mia Barron performance, and then the three of us will come back and talk for another 15 minutes or so, and then open up the floor to questions. We have some questions already, but please, if you have questions, don't hesitate or be shy to put them into the Q&A. And I figured I'm going to play both a kind of panelist's role and a moderator's role here. So what I wanted to do, I thought first, was start with you, Laila and Steph, and talk about, let's open broadly. We don't, this volume is the 80s and 90s, which is when Didion had shifted into a kind of a more, I'd say, geopolitical international focus in her work, particularly in terms of Latin America. But I don't see any reason why we need to avoid the California work if we want, or anything else. We can talk about sort of the broad range of the career. So let me just start by, I've given you my little capsule Didion origin story. Let's start with, both of you, and any one of you can jump in, your sense of her, where you first sort of came across her. I think we can talk a little bit about her as a kind of California writer, but I also am interested in her more broadly, just in the same way that I'm interested in the idea that California literature is in fact national literature and international literature, as much as anything else. So Laila, why don't we start with you and your sort of early, I guess, initial impressions, let's say.
Well, similar to yours, but probably a little bit later in life. I came to her to her work in my 30s, and I had been living in California for quite a while by then, but everywhere I went, everybody was talking about Joan Didion. And so finally I thought, okay, I need to read this woman and see what the big deal is about. And so I think the first one I read was Slouching Towards Bethlehem. That was the first of her books that I read. And then I went and I read pretty much everything else. I was really delighted to be asked to be part of this conversation. It's always such a delight to be in conversation with you and with Steph. What I will say, just to kind of get us started about this, the conversation is, it wasn't until I saw the books sort of collected in this chronological fashion that something sort of stood out to me about her writing in the 60s and 70s versus in the 80s and 90s. And you hinted at it earlier when you talked about sort of the geopolitical dimension in the 80s and 90s. So in the 60s and 70s, the work is very much focused on California, on narratives of place. The novels are, I would say, novels about California. They're constructed sort of in a traditional way. Then when we moved to the 80s and 90s, with novels like Democracy and The Last Thing He Wanted, the topic is different, the characters are different, and even the way in which the books are constructed, the novels are constructed is different. So she turns herself into an observer within her own novels, where I think she has a line in Democracy where she says something like, "Call me the author," and then it's her basically bringing in the characters and all that. So the novels are also fashioned in a different way. There's a broader interest in place well outside California. Obviously, she writes about Salvador, Miami, other places. And so I think that that's also reflected in the way in which she was thinking about her fiction. And that's not something that really, because I had been reading her sort of in a haphazard fashion, it wasn't something that stood out to me until I saw it in the way in which the books were collected.
It's really interesting you mentioned that. I want to talk about this because it's something that I sort of came across when I was putting these together and reading my way or rereading my way back through her body of work in a chronological way.
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about actually the kind of the relationship between her fiction and nonfiction, which when I was younger and reading the books individually, even as they were coming out, I was much less acutely aware of. Steph, I'm wondering if you can kind of jump in on that same sort of question about her and your initial sense of her and what her, I guess what, you know, how she affected you or how she struck you, I suppose.
I was trying to remember whether I first read Slouching Towards Bethlehem or Play It As It Lays. I think it was Play It As It Lays. And I read that shortly after moving back to LA from law school. And it was my then boyfriend, now husband's copy that he loaned to me. And he was like, you should read this. You know, I actually was never clear on whether he gave it to me, but anyway, we're married now. I remember, you know, it was a year I graduated from law school. I was trying to figure out what to do with my life because, like, even though I graduated from law school, I didn't have like a lot of work lined up, and I was trying to publish my first novel. And so I read this book, and it was just this character driving up and down California, just up and down, up and down. And, you know, it's this story of like kind of beautiful malaise. And that image has stuck with me. I mean, I don't remember everything about that book, but I remember all the driving. And, you know, I write about California and I write about Los Angeles. And that was something that was really striking to me. You know, and it's something I cherish. It made me feel bonded to her in a way, you know, and I think a lot of people get that from Joan Didion. She writes about such a broad range of topics and places that people feel a little bit like they have a piece of her. And I feel that very strongly. You know, I think that's why she resonates so much with people, you know. And I don't know if in 2010, when I first started reading her, if like, you know, you could go outside and see a Joan Didion tote bag in like the average coffee shop, but like that's certainly the way it is now, you know. And I think it's a wonderful thing. She's this incredibly lyrical, incisive writer who connects with everybody, you know. And I like to think I have a little bit of share in that.
I have two of those tote bags in my hall closet, as a matter of fact. But I think that's a really good and a really interesting point. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things for me when I was first reading her was that she actually showed me coming from the East Coast and carrying all of those Eastern sort of stereotypes about California, and particularly about Southern California. She showed me a California that I was drawn to, which in part was the elemental California. I mean, you know, she's always writing about the physical landscape, like she's writing about fire and writing about, you know, floods, and writing about sort of, you know, the Santa Ana winds and all of the kind of the mechanistic aspect of the landscape, which is something that I had completely overlooked in terms of thinking about California mythologically. But she is also tying or dropping into certain kind of mythic structures of California, right? The Oregon Trail, the old California families, the kind of Sacramento River Valley, and those kind of things. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about how she kind of, I guess, kind of twists or turns the kind of mythologies of California to her own use. She's not exactly denying them, although later she contradicts, you know, in Where I Was From, she goes back and kind of rewrites her own California history, but she's kind of, you know, she's adapting them, she's using them as creative material. And I wonder, both from the point of both of your perspectives as writers, but also from your perspective as readers, and I think those are, you know, obviously very intertwined, what your sense of her sort of use of the bigger kind of mythic questions to get at more personal questions. I think, Steph, your point about her kind of representing different things to different people is really an interesting and important one. I guess that's a jump ball question. So whoever wants to jump in.
I will say that one of the things that drew me to her work is that, so I'm an immigrant to the United States, and I also happen to not be a native speaker of English. And one of the things that drew me about her work was the use of syntax. That was initially what drew me to her. It was really this technical aspect. It was the first time that I saw sort of how she was constructing paragraphs in such a way that she would leave the sort of more incisive or more telling detail towards the end of the paragraph. So I learned a great deal just in terms of like how to use syntax to push forward theme from her work. But also as an immigrant, and this is not from the perspective of language, but from the perspective of history, I did learn a great deal from her about, as you said, the older California, the sort of settler families that came to California, sort of the mythologies of the state that I did not know about until I read her work.
Steph?
Yeah, I was thinking when you talked about mythologies and, you know, the way that she has represented California across the decades, you know, I watched the excellent documentary on her life, and you know, and I've done a lot of reading about her, and well, something that was striking just learning about her life is like how my broad perception of Joan Didion has always been like very like artistic, like culturally bohemian, but like all the touchstones that you hear are like the most glamorous things in the world. Like the parties that she went to, they're like, you know, going to like the Polo Lounge, which like has $40 hamburgers, you know, and it's interesting because I think that she is like a very beloved white woman with a lot of cultural cachet who has been allowed into very diverse spaces, and who I think the reason that people love her still is that she is so observant and so detailed. And, you know, I think we're always, I think when you know, people who are from like marginalized backgrounds, like let in an observer, what we tend to look for is somebody who is listening and who is paying attention and who is respectful, you know. And I think that she is just so good on the like sentence and detail level that it's hard to argue with anything that she's saying. Mm-hmm. You know, I think like she's an example of somebody who's just ability to interpret and to observe is so strong that, like, you know, sometimes she almost disappears, and the clarity of her language kind of brings forth these observations in a way that like that makes this writer invisible on her own page, even though she's such a force in you know, in life. Like, she's obviously like a huge cultural icon, but I think it's something that impresses me is her ability to kind of present her views while making them feel almost unfiltered. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
It's interesting that you mentioned the documentary, because it reminded me of that essay in Slouching Towards Bethlehem. No, actually, I think it's in the White Album, where she goes to the Haight-Ashbury and she talks about the children, right? And she's sitting in the corner taking notes, and the sort of incredible quotes that she manages to include in some of her pieces. You can't get that unless you have the ability to sit quietly in the corner and make yourself invisible. So, you know, she famously said that people tend to forget that her presence runs counter to their interests. And she really makes use of that ability. That is probably the thing that I find most it's just so admirable about her work, is like that patience, the waiting until you can hear that quote that is going to make it into the piece. In terms of just to circle back onto the mythologies, it was interesting to me to hear that perspective, because it was, as Steph said, the perspective of this woman who's a native Californian, who's from Sacramento or the Sacramento area, and brings that specific lens to her writing about California. So this is not the kind of writing that you will go to learn, for example, about California's Hispanic history, for example, or any of that. So it is limited in that sense. But because of her ability to sort of to just curate, just to find in the right quotes and including that in her writing, it's always enriching to read it, would be the best way I would put it.
I was thinking about that line. I actually think about this line all the time. I think it's from the same essay that you're talking about, where she says, a writer is always selling somebody out. I think about that line all the time. It's something that, it's one of those things that, like, ever since I read it, you know, I can never get it out of my head. And I don't think any writer should, because I think it is part of being a writer. But yeah, that has always stuck with me.
It's going to be my epitaph, I think. I think about that line all the time. It reminds me of that Janet Malcolm line that, you know, at the beginning of The Journalist and the Murderer, where she says, you know, any journalist honest has to admit that what they do for a living is morally indefensible. And there is something really interesting, I think, in Didion about that complicity. Exactly, as you're saying, right? My presence in your living room, you forget that my presence in your living room runs counter to your best interests, and it always does, which is the codicil. Yeah. And I think that's right. I mean, it's interesting because I first read her, well, when I read Slouching Towards Bethlehem, in addition to, my mother's mission to save me from Haight-Ashbury, I was the first time I ever really thought about nonfiction writing or essay writing as literature. I had thought about it, as much, more as academic writing or something like, literature to me was fiction and poetry. And yet watching what Didion did on the page, watching how the sentences work, the scene construction, those little fragments like Slouching Towards Bethlehem is an essay that's constructed of, like 45 apparently disconnected fragments, but somehow they add up, capturing the atomization of the moment. I had never even thought that you could do writing in that way, and that you could connect art to current events in that sense, right? That what you were living through could become the substance of narrative art. And I agree, Laila. I think the syntax, now we can nerd out a little bit as writers. When I'm teaching, as I sometimes do, her work, I teach in the essay Los Angeles Notebook, because there's this riff where she talks about driving the Harbor Freeway during the Watts riots and seeing the fires. And she says, driving the freeway, one could see the city burning as we always knew it would in the end. And this sort of subtle move from the pronouns, right? From the one, which is a singular pronoun, but an impersonal one, to the we, which is the personal plural pronoun, when we really know that what she's talking about in both pronouns is herself, is really fascinating, the kind of movement from the individual to the universal. And I do think that's a syntactic move that opens up that individual sensibility to the kind of, draws the reader in. I don't know if anyone has, that's not really a question, it's more a statement, but I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on kind of the way that writing moves, or that relationship between her as a commercial writer. A lot of those essays were written for, glossy magazines, Saturday Evening Post or Life or whatever, that there's a kind of interesting, sort of, I would say, an interesting relation, not a pure, she is a pure artist, but she's operating in a commercial territory,
Yeah, I think that's another thing really that speaks to me about her work, is her ability to move so seamlessly from fiction to nonfiction. And yet you read one page, or even sometimes even one paragraph of her writing, and you're reading Didion. And there aren't that many writers who are like that. For me, Didion and Baldwin were both writers whose ability to write both fiction and nonfiction really stood out as models. And they're very, very different. They pay attention to very different things in their writing. And so from her, I think what really I found the most enriching is learning about how to construct these essays, the role of syntax, the attention to place, the role of devices like, like juxtaposition, the way she uses that, and repetition. So she's, yes, I learned a great deal from her.
And passive voice, which is the
oh, yes.
kind of the recessed way that passive voice works is really phenomenal stuff.
Yeah, I also think there's this kind of disconnect for me between she seems to me as a public figure, as somebody who almost has this mystique, you don't hear about her doing bookstore events and all that, and I feel like her appearances are very limited. But then you read these memoirs, or you'll read these very kind of almost detached essays where she appears suddenly and talks about, going to Hawaii instead of getting into divorce. And it's here's this voice that's it's confiding in you, but there's this distance that is kind of fascinating to me. And I'm not a memoirist, and there's something so naked about writing about, obviously that's part of the gig, writing about your life in this very naked way. And yet she has this, it's almost like a Lady Godiva thing. She has this lofty feel to her, she feels untouchable, even though I know so many deeply private things about her. Maybe it's because all of us know so many deeply private things about her.
Yeah, I think the centering of that, the kind of, again, the way that she is, even in the pieces that aren't about her, we kind of learn something about her just simply by the way she frames them, but simply by the kind of touchstones. You think about Some Dreamers of the Golden Dream, where she sets up sort of the class distinction between San Bernardino and, you know, and the more coastal climes of Los Angeles. You know, and there's certainly some kind of class judgment there that we can, without any question. But she's, you know, she's positioning the piece that way. It's not simply going to be it's not going to just be an unfiltered account. There's going to be that interpretational voice on top of it.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let's take a quick break from this, and we'll watch this video performance by Mia Barron of the opening of the White Album, and then when we come back from that, because she's talking about kind of narrative and how it works or how it fails, I want to talk about our own senses of sort of narrative and narrative dislocation. So let's see that video.
We tell ourselves stories in order to live. The princess is caged in the consulate. The man with the candy will lead the children into the sea. The naked woman on the ledge outside the window on the 16th floor is a victim of accident, or the naked woman is an exhibitionist, and it would be interesting to know which. We tell ourselves that it makes some difference whether the naked woman is about to commit a mortal sin, or is about to register a political protest, or is about to be, the Aristophanic view, snatched back to the human condition by the fireman in priest's clothing, just visible in the window behind her, the one smiling at the telephoto lens. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of 5. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience. Or at least we do for a while. I am talking here about a time when I began to doubt the premises of all the stories I had ever told myself, a common condition, but one I found troubling. I suppose this period began around 1966 and continued until 1971. During those 5 years, I appeared, on the face of it, a competent enough member of some community or another, a signer of contracts and air travel cards, a citizen. I wrote a couple of times a month for one magazine or another, published 2 books, worked on several motion pictures, participated in the paranoia of the time, in the raising of a small child, and in the entertainment of large numbers of people passing through my house, made gingham curtains for spare bedrooms, remembered to ask agents if any reduction of points would be pari passu with the financing studio, put lentils to soak on Saturday night for lentil soup on Sunday, made quarterly FICA payments, and renewed my driver's license on time, missing on the written examination only the question about the financial responsibility of California drivers. It was a time of my life when I was frequently named. I was named godmother to children. I was named lecturer and panelist, colloquist and conferee. I was even named in 1968 a Los Angeles Times Woman of the Year, along with Mrs. Ronald Reagan, the Olympic swimmer Debbie Meyer, and 10 other California women who seem to keep in touch and do good works. I did no good works, but I tried to keep in touch. I was responsible. I recognized my name when I saw it. Once in a while, I even answered letters addressed to me, not exactly upon receipt, but eventually, particularly if the letters had come from strangers. During my absence from the country these past 18 months, such replies would begin. This was an adequate enough performance as improvisations go. The only problem was that my entire education, everything I had ever been told or had told myself, insisted that the production was never meant to be improvised. I was supposed to have a script and had mislaid it. I was supposed to hear cues and no longer did. I was meant to know the plot, but all I knew was what I saw. Flash pictures in variable sequence, images with no meaning beyond their temporary arrangement. Not a movie, but a cutting room experience. In what would probably be the middle of my life, I wanted still to believe in the narrative and in the narrative's intelligibility. But to know that one could change the sense with every cut was to begin to perceive the experience as rather more electrical than ethical.
All right. So let's talk a little. I mean, that famous line, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. I always thought that you could collapse, that's the first sentence of the first paragraph. And then we go through the litany of those stories. And then the first sentence of the second paragraph is, or at least we do for a while. And I've always kind of in my mind kind of collapsed that into one sentence. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, or at least we do for a while. And it becomes a double-edged sentence that includes both the necessity of narrative and also the kind of limitation or fallibility of narrative. One of the things that reading Didion taught me, and then other writers kind of brought home in more detail to me, was this notion of kind of the subjectivity of narrative, the kind of fragmentation of narrative, the way that narrative is, as she says, if you can cut it in all sorts of different ways. What does she say? More electrical than ethical. I should say parenthetically, I also love the fact that she remembers the one question she got wrong on the driver's license test. But I'm curious about your own sense of narrative and its kind of fluidity, maybe, or its its substantiality or its insubstantiality. Both of you and myself as well are, we're committed to narrative both as a kind of professional dedication, but also I want to think as a kind of personal or even perhaps emotional way we move through the world. So in terms of Didion's sense of sort of narrative as fragmentary, or the potential breakdown of narrative, the breakdown of narrative's intelligibility, I'm curious about each of your thoughts as writers, readers, and humans on that subject. We've certainly just lived through a period of narrative collapse and are still living through it, I believe.
I mean, I think there are different ways to look at it. And I think listening to that beautiful reading, by the way, beautiful reading, I think she's trying to get at the difference between living through life just as we all do on a day-to-day basis, and actually telling a story about life. And then in the telling of stories, a lot of things get rearranged. And so you impose, as she says, a narrative line on that. So we do tell ourselves stories in order to live. The first time that I read that, it actually made me think about the 1001 Nights, because in that book, the Scheherazade has to tell a story or else she will not live another night. So telling a story becomes her way of surviving. And to me, it gets at something that's very elemental, that's very deep about human nature, which is that we do need to tell ourselves stories. Whatever that story may be, we do not survive without telling that story. And the other thing that strikes me, upon listening to this segment again, is that it almost sounded to me, listening to it, I recognized, because I saw it in myself, the sort of high functioning depression, where you can actually do all of the things that are required of you and on time and perfectly, while also suffering from what can only be described as like this sort of mental disorder, this collapse of your own self-narrative.
Yeah, I've been experiencing that exact dislocation very acutely the last week or so. So I completely hear you, Steph. Your sense of that kind of the sense of narrative, either continuity and breakdown, or the kind of contrast or contradiction of those ideas.
I think part of what makes most of us want to be writers, I think, and what makes us good at it, if we are good at it, is the ability to see connection and pull them out. I think on the extreme end, that's the definition of paranoia, right? Like seeing too many connections. And I think that's where it gets kind of interesting. It's like, I think like, and I think there is something about seeing all the connections in the world and kind of seeing how all the strings that go across our present day connect to the past, connect to the future, what it means if this hasn't changed, or for what things will be like 30 years on, and I think like seeing the connections between like people in our lives and the people in other countries and all these things that, actually thinking about it too much is definitely enough on its own to make someone feel paranoid and, yes, depressed. But I also think it's what's exciting about writing and about reading, even thinking about like reading Didion, just seeing all the kind of connection points between the things that she talks about and the things in our own lives, and I think this especially about when I read Didion talking about Los Angeles. She lived in my city before I did, and all these all these areas on the map, you know, have been, she has been in them. She's inhabited these spaces before I have, and she has her different takes on it. And I think like, and I think having those connections through place, like putting one person in touch with another, like across time, and it's just one of those things that like, it's hard not to read into those connections. You know, I think I think about this a lot with Raymond Chandler too. You know, these are artists who I feel like have defined my city. You know, even I know that Joan Didion has kind of stepped away from being identified as an LA writer, but you know, I think that imposition that we're doing all the time on our physical world is like part of what we do, right? I think and I think without an understanding of narrative and without putting that on the world, everything does feel disconnected. Everything would feel disconnected. And I just find that really bland and uninteresting, you know? So I think that feeling, you know, even when I'm writing, of everything feeling like it's in little pieces and it needs to be kneaded 100 million times before it looks like anything, you know, I think that's the exciting part, kind of imposing that structure and believing that structure exists somewhere, even if you haven't found it yet.
Yeah, and seeing there's a moment. I mean, I assume this is true for both of you as well. There's a moment in the writing of a long work, or the drafting of a long work, where, you know, if you're lucky, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I see where this is going, or I see where this could be going, or oh yeah, all of these sort of what appear to be these random threads, they're starting to coalesce, and maybe not in the way that I expected that they would coalesce, but I'm seeing a path that I can follow. And, you know, I am always aware of the kind of subjectivity of that in some sense. I mean, the path it could be a different path on a different day. And it may end up becoming a different path in the revision process or something, but there is that sense of of something taking shape out of the fog of the chaos in some way. I want to talk a little bit though about that notion of Los Angeles too, because I agree. I mean, it's hard to characterize her exclusively as a Los Angeles writer or even as a California writer at this point, but certainly those roots are important. And I also, as a transplant, when I first moved to Los Angeles, one of the things that confounded me about the place was that I didn't appear to have any kind of through line. I couldn't make sense of it. And then after a while, I realized, I mean, she has this line in Pacific Distances where she says, you know, I realized one day, you know, driving by myself in the car, that narrative was sentimental. I realized that sense of through line was not necessarily a narrative that fit the city that I was in. I think, you know, Los Angeles itself is a kind of fragmentary collage city where we each have to kind of construct our own coherent narrative of the city, the one that makes sense to us. And I wonder, granted, from Sacramento, moved to New York, came back to Los Angeles in 1934, she was 30 years old, but how much do you see that kind of, that sense of Los Angeles, that sort of fragmentary collage sense of Los Angeles influencing or emerging in her work, even the work that isn't about Southern California or California at all?
I mean, I think it's interesting that this is a transplant and she is so associated with Los Angeles. It just makes sense because Los Angeles itself is a city that's filled with people who are from somewhere else. There are so few people that can claim to actually be from here. 40% of the city is not only not from California, but from not even the United States. So it is a city that is full of transplants, and it seems apt that she's so associated with it. I've lost my train of thought. I forget what your question was.
I forgot what my question was about 3 seconds after it left my mouth.
I tend to do that. Oh my God. I need a narrative line to impose on my own.
Illustrating its form is you know,
yes.
Form following function here, or vice versa.
Well, I do think that a lot of her writing on California is also fragmentary. It's in these essays, it's in these kind of digestible hunks that were published separately and that together feel coherent and cohesive. But she didn't write like one California book that was like a definitive like whole piece about like what it means to be California or Los Angeles or Hollywood or San Francisco. Like none of that. She didn't do that. And I think maybe that's why her essays kind of ring true. You know, I don't think any of them like kind of pretend to encapsulate the whole. You know, I think a lot about I am an LA native, but I'm also a huge booster of the city, and I kind of got to know LA better once I moved back home from school. You know, because as as a kid growing up in the Valley. It's not like I was seeing all of LA, you know, also, and so I feel like I got to know LA around the time I was reading Didion. And also Jonathan Gold was somebody who has done a really good job kind of giving LA narrative form. And I think I read when he died that a great line about how he wrote about the LA that people want to move to. And I've seen that in a lot of kind of my friends and other people who like moved to LA as transplants. They're attracted to this vision that was put out piecemeal, you know. And I think Didion has to do with that. Jonathan Gold has to do with that. But it's this image of a city that doesn't have to be any one thing. You know, I think the appeal of it is that you can come and kind of build your own space, find your own people. And I think you know, if she had attempted to impose a really rigid structure on the city or on California, I think she would have failed. But I think she was honest about it and kind of gave her piece. And I think that's always interesting to see from anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think that actually it's really interesting that you bring Jonathan up, because I think about him in this context too. I mean, you know, she does, as you were saying earlier, have a lot of that glamour, the Hollywood glamour, you know, the parties with who else was there sitting in, you know, when in the White Album, when she talks about finding out about the Manson killing, she's in her sister-in-law's pool in Beverly Hills, right? Her sister, she doesn't have to say that her brother-in-law is Dominic Dunne, who's a producer. But at the same time, she's also kind of writing about the vernacular Los Angeles, like when she's writing about the mansion or the ramshackle mansion they live in on Franklin, right? Mm-hmm. Going to the supermarket in a bikini and having someone ram their card into her saying, what a thing to wear to Ralph's. You know, I never realized that Ralph's had a dress code. But, you know, that reminds me a lot of people like Jonathan, or for that matter, non-writers, people like Ed Ruscha, you know, Ed Ruscha photographing the length of sunset, or Jonathan eating his way down Pico Boulevard and writing about it, that sense of these broad urban streets that we just kind of take for granted and don't appear to fit into the mythic structure of the city, actually kind of being the underpinning of the city in its way. Mm-hmm. I want to end for us, and then we'll go to questions from the audience with a question about, I'm noticing a number of questions in the chat about her fiction. And as we said at the very beginning, right, we were talking at the very beginning, I always sort of gave her fiction, or tended to give her fiction, a bit of short shrift until I read all of these books and, you know, this reading all the books back to back to back. And began to see how the fiction connected, or how all the work kind of connected or was in conversation with each other through genre and time. And, you know, I have to say, Laila, you were talking about Democracy. I think Democracy is a remarkable novel. I think my favorite of all the novels. It's also the most sort of non-fictional of the novels, in the sense that it's narrated by a character named Joan Didion.
Joan Didion, yeah.
Who's presenting this as if these are people she knew, in a way that is not unrelated to the way that she operates in nonfiction. So I'm just curious, as a kind of closing question for this part of the conversation, before we move it into the other questions, what is your sense of her as a fiction writer? What do you think the relationship, there is a question, we'll even jump into it. There's one question in the chat about, you know, would she have been the essayist she is without the novels, or the novelist she is without the essays? How do you, as readers of the work, how do you see the relationship between her fiction and her nonfiction writing?
This is a question that I think about, that personally I hate to receive, is to talk about the relationship between fiction and nonfiction. I don't want to be at the end of that question. But seeing the collection and going through, because I've been thinking about the work chronologically, it really became clearer to me how one was informing the other. And I think that's particularly true of the works in the second volume from the 80s and 90s, where you really see how the work that she's doing as a foreign correspondent, I guess you would say, in Salvador, that appears, has clearly informed how she writes in The Last Thing She Wanted. Or The Last Thing He Wanted. And then the same thing with Democracy, where you see that the time that she has, all the work that she's done writing about Hawaii is like paying off in that book, as well as the work that she has done about talking to various policymakers and undercover people and fixers and so on. So it all gets used in the fiction. And it's interesting because I would say that, I mean, I like Democracy a lot, but I also like the earlier novels. So Run River and Plays As It Lays, and then they're all very different. I think that I would say that one informs the other. It's very difficult for me as somebody who writes both fiction and nonfiction to say that like exactly how they relate. I can see that they inform, one informs the other, but beyond that, I'm going to need to think about that before I can say.
Okay, Steph?
You know, I'm much more familiar with her nonfiction than I am with her fiction. I read Play It As It Lays and I read A Book of Common Prayer, which didn't stick with me, I will say. I read it a number of years ago and it just didn't have the same impact and I was expecting to love it, you know, because I had loved everything I'd read by her. And I think, you know, another thing is like Play It As It Lays, the voice has a lot of similarities with her kind of narrative nonfiction voice. And I think, and I think like that's probably the most important part for me when I read her at all, you know, just that voice, that clarity, you know, just hearing the reading, even just now, I was thinking about how, you know, she writes so elegantly and in a way that would be really hard to mimic. And that sounds very much like her. And yet it's so easy to understand and it just flows. And I think that has a lot to do with her popularity, honestly. And I think that voice is always there in the nonfiction. And maybe in A Book of Common Prayer, I wasn't getting it. But in Play It As It Lays, I was. So I feel like, you know, maybe for me, at least, like the closer she is to the work, the more connection I feel. But I don't know. I guess I should read Democracy. I haven't read that one. But, you know, I have lots of Joan Didion novels to read. But like, to be honest, after Book of Common Prayer, I was less motivated to read those.
Right. I do think that the earlier, I will say that I think that the earlier novels are less influenced by her nonfiction writing than her later novels. Like I said earlier, the later novels even involve her as either an observer or as the author, Joan Didion. So it's very clear where the nonfiction is sort of penetrating the fiction and staying there. And I mean, everything about how it's written is so similar to the essays themselves. So I would say that the nonfiction influences the fiction in the later work, not so much in the earlier work.
Yeah, I think it starts with the movement from slouching to Play It As It Lays, just in terms of that kind of ennui and the sort of that sense of the kind of raw elemental nature of Los Angeles or Southern California. I do want to say about Play It As It Lays that, you know, for me, that book was just revelatory because I realized, you know, you could write about the freeways. You could write, you know, you could write about driving. You could write about these things that we tend to think of as sort of just, I don't know, you know, not worth considering, but in fact, they are a place where we spend a lot of time. And that notion of, you know, being afraid to merge lanes or exit, you know, I mean, I've certainly had that experience in my life. So I started to recognize some of that vulnerability. And I think that in a character like Maria Wyeth, we're seeing Didion maybe express some of her own vulnerability in a way where she's got a little bit of distance because the character isn't her. Or doesn't have her name. And so she can write about it in that sense. I also think it's really interesting that, you know, I agree with you, Laila, I think Run River is a really fantastic first novel. It's got its problems, but it's a terrific novel and it captures something right at the cusp, like California, right at the cusp of change from, you know, mid 20th century to kind of modern California. But there's something really fascinating about the way that in Where I Was From, she spends, you know, a chunk of that book basically deconstructing and reassessing that novel based on what she's learned. And so there's something, again, I mean, even kind of personified by the relationship of those two books that expresses that relationship between her fiction and nonfiction writing.
I hadn't thought about that, Where I Was From. I have to revisit that. I read it years ago. I'll have to go back. Oh, how interesting.
That's one of my, and that, I mean, again, without going, we'll get to questions, but I think that's a really important hinge book also, because it's theoretically the first of the memoirs leading into Year of Magical Thinking, but it's not exactly a memoir. It's a sort of a family book, but also a kind of a California history and a deconstruction of California myth. I think that's a really underrated one. Yeah. All right, so I've got a few questions, and I'm going to throw one. This is from Charles Sperling in Flushing, New York, who says, Didion took the title of Slouching Towards Bethlehem from Yeats' Second Coming. At the start of the poem, we learn that the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Do you think with the 2020 election that is still true? I used to quote, I used to quote that poem quite a lot in the years between 2016 and 2020. But I'm wondering, do we, what's our sense in terms of our sense of kind of, I just think that's a curious question. Where do you think we are right now? One of the things that I think has been fascinating and disturbing about the last 25, I mean, I don't even mean the last 5 years in American politics, but going back to like, the Southern strategy has been this kind of bifurcation of narrative. And it seems to me that Didion in some way in the late 60s and early 70s, when she was starting to really explore those ideas, was tapping into something that was personal to her, but was also collective. In Slouching Towards Bethlehem, for instance, she talks about, a hippie on Haight Street says, "I'm trying to get to New York. Do you know someone who's going to New York?" And she says, "I don't know anyone who's going to New York, but I know someone who's going to Chicago." And the kid says to her, "I don't want to go to Chicago. I want to go to New York," with no idea that Chicago's 2/3 of the way from San Francisco to New York. And it seemed to me to be a really interesting moment of narrative collapse there, where people having different, not even overlapping narratives, but different separate narratives. And I think that that's one of the things she touches on quite heavily in her writing. Laila.
I was going to say, she talks about this very clearly in Political Fictions, which is a later book that's in the late 90s or early 2000s. But this is the book in which she's covering various political campaigns. And she has one of the essays is about Bill Clinton and his campaign. And it's just fascinating reading that, because anybody that tells you that somehow like this sort of splintering of narrative that's been happening under the previous president was new it hasn't been paying attention. You can see in that book already that people are being exposed to completely different stories, or to at the very least different emphases in the same story.
Yeah, and also in that book, she talks a lot about the sort of the political consultant's fixation on basically owning the narrative, right? That that narrative is a competition.
Right.
It's there to be manipulated for your ends. Stuff.
Yeah, and she talks about the role of the media, and she talks about how she thought that the media was supposed to be a neutral observer, and she talks about how it's not always the case. I mean, it's everything that we saw. You could see it happening earlier in her coverage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of like needing to control the narrative, it's something that comes up in like the courtroom too, where it's just like you're storytelling, you have this audience, the jury, and you have this American audience where you're looking at like, are you going to believe this set of storylines, or are you going to believe this one? And I think what's scary is when all the facts are also under dispute. That's like where it becomes, I think, that's where you get to the real, like the center cannot hold, like what are you supposed to do when like we can't agree on anything? But I think like, we're all motivated to believe one set of facts over another, or one narrative over another. It is like unfortunate when narrative does become completely detached from reality, and when people are cynical enough and want to hold on to power enough that they'll completely exploit that and exacerbate that separation. One thing I will say, just to bring it back to Didion, is she's not on Twitter, and I wonder sometimes if like looking at her versus Joyce Carol Oates, I'm like, she probably did the smarter thing.
Yeah, there are days where I feel like it would just be totally all of us should do that. That would be the smarter thing to do in general. So a couple more questions. One is, so this is Rosalie Davis from Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts, asks, do you see Didion, and this comes back to something we were touching on earlier, I think, do you see Didion as more of a journalist or more as a writer of creative nonfiction in terms of the nonfiction work? I think this is a really interesting and complicated question that we probably won't do justice to it. But I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts on that subject.
I think it depends on the essay, honestly, because I've thought one or the, I mean, just thinking back, I feel like some fall into one category and some into the other. And I feel like it depends on how much she inserts herself. Cause like, I think sometimes like, I really forget that she's there. And sometimes she's right there, and you can't. And I think that's the difference for me. That might be a simplistic viewing of the separation between journalism and creative nonfiction, but that's kind of where I see it, how the presence of the art is.
Interesting, yeah. Laila?
I was going to say, mostly for me, because of her emphasis on character and the way in which the narrative never unfolds in the way that you would see it unfolding in a traditional journalistic way, that I would lean towards the creative nonfiction as being her, what she's doing. Having said that, I don't like, it's interesting because yesterday I was talking to somebody else about fiction, and there was this huge debate about how to characterize a particular type of fiction. And to me, being a person who writes novels, I'm less interested in where they are categorized than as in whether, you know, they're any good. So with her writing, I mean, I don't know that it serves us one way or another to say that it's journalism or that it's creative nonfiction. What it is that it's just really good writing that people keep coming back to.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. As someone who's generally anti-category on myself, I feel like, you know, that is what it is. I also, as you know, as someone who has spent a large part of my career engaged in the practice of journalism, I want to stand up for journalism as an art as well as essay writing. But I do think she's doing both, or it doesn't matter. I mean, for me, one of the most, as I said earlier, one of the most exciting things about discovering her as a young wannabe writer, because at that age, at 18, I was already trying to be a writer, was that it could grow out of the direct experience of the world around me. I could write something and aspire to make it literature, or make it an essay that was directly responsive to the circumstances, the social or political or cultural circumstances through which I was living. I hadn't been, you know, I thought I was well read, but it wasn't that well read. And I hadn't really been exposed to that. And that idea still excites me, the idea that I can kind of comment on things that are happening, or create a narrative that deals with things that are happening, or incorporates things that are happening, that art doesn't have to sit separate from, in fact, it shouldn't sit separate from society or from culture or political life, but in fact has to be part of all of those things have to be woven together. And you know, there are others. Baldwin, as you said, Laila, another example. They are very different writers, but there are some similarities in terms of the scope of their vision, and also the just absolute acuity of their language. But there's something really important, or there was something really foundationally important to me about that sense of connection to time as well as to place in her work. I think we are basically out of time. So I'm going to first say thank you, Steph. Thank you, Laila. Always a pleasure to talk. Just like, hopefully next time we see each other, we can be face to face. But so. Really, delightful to talk to you for the last hour or so. And thank you, Max, for setting this up for us. And I guess we'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you all very much for really a wonderful hour. And there's like a zillion questions we didn't get to. A couple of them were about James Baldwin and Joan Didion. So maybe it's good that we ended there. But anyway, thanks to you all. You've been listening to Steph Cha, Laila Lalami, and David Ulin discuss the life and work of Joan Didion. Her writings from the 1980s and 90s have just been published in a new volume in the Library of America, number 341 in the series, edited by David Ulin, who also edited a companion volume devoted to the 1960s and 70s. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Thursday, June 17, it's a summer celebration of literary encounters with American birds. Grab a bird-themed cocktail. We will post recipes for tequila mockingbirds and other cocktails, and join us as we delve into the magic and mystery of human-avian encounters. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about the Library of America Joan Didion edition and links to purchase that, American Birds, a Literary Companion, and other volumes of great American writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to David, Steph, and Laila, to Griffin Dunne for joining us, to the amazing Mia Barron for her extraordinary reading, and have a great evening.